Welcome to the News Hour. The Supreme Court heard arguments today in a legal case that could vastly expand presidential powers. At stake are 90 years of precedent that have kept presidents from being able to remove members of independent government agencies. The case looks at whether President Trump acted legally in firing Rebecca Slaughter, a Democratic member of the bipartisan Federal Trade Commission, saying her service was inconsistent with Trump administration priorities. Slaughter sued, arguing that commissioners can only be fired for inefficiency, neglect of duty, or malfeasance. Today, Trump administration lawyers argued that gives agencies too much power.
It continues to tempt Congress to erect at the heart of our government a headless fourth branch, insulated from political accountability and democratic control.
Okay, so this is absolutely massive, and most people aren't paying attention to it. President Trump is systematically dismantling the independence of federal agencies, like actually destroying the system that's kept these agencies free from political control for decades. He's firing commissioners who are supposed to have job protection. He's installing White House loyalists to oversee agencies that are supposed to be independent. He's challenging century-old legal precedents that protect these agencies from presidential interference. And the Supreme Court just heard arguments that could give Trump the green light to completely politicize agencies like the Federal Reserve, the Federal Trade Commission, and dozens of others. This isn't some technical legal dispute. This is Trump trying to grab control over every part of the federal government, and if he succeeds, the implications are absolutely staggering.
But before we go any further, real quick, let's be honest. You can't really trust mainstream media anymore. That's why we built Pump Politics, to bring you real stories, real context, and no corporate spin. If you want to stay ahead of the headlines, join our free newsletter. We'll send the news straight to your inbox every day. Just click the link in the description to join. And if you just want to support what we're doing, join us, be part of the community that actually cares about the truth. All right, let's get back to the video.
That is at the center of this case. It said Congress enacted these removal statutes precisely because it wants agencies like the FTC to be independent, and it isn't infringing on FDR executive power because the agency doesn't exercise substantial executive power. So this is a decision that dates back to 1935 and in fact involves very similar facts. FDR wanted to fire a commissioner of the Federal Trade Commission in no small part to put his own people in the job. The commissioner resisted. He eventually was fired, went to court.
What's happening? Independent agencies are supposed to be independent for a reason. Agencies like the Federal Reserve control monetary policy. Agencies like the FTC enforce antitrust law and protect consumers. Agencies like the Securities and Exchange Commission regulate Wall Street. And these agencies are deliberately set up to be insulated from presidential politics. Because if the president can just fire anyone who disagrees with him, if he can replace agency leaders with loyalists who'll do whatever he wants, then these agencies become political tools instead of neutral regulators. And that's incredibly dangerous. That's how you get corruption. That's how you get economic disasters. That's how you lose the independence that makes these agencies credible and effective. But Trump doesn't care about independence. He thinks these agencies should answer to him. He thinks as president he should be able to fire anyone for any reason, and he's been acting on that belief. Trump has fired dozens of independent agency leaders, commissioners at the FTC, board members at other agencies, people who by law are supposed to have job protection and can only be removed for cause, meaning misconduct or incompetence. But Trump's just firing them anyway. He's saying the laws that protect them are unconstitutional, that they violate his executive power, and he's daring the courts to stop him. And the Supreme Court is about to decide whether Trump's right. On December 8th, just a few days ago, the court heard arguments in a case about whether Trump can fire FTC commissioners without cause. The case centers on a legal precedent called Humphrey's Executor. That's a 1935 Supreme Court decision that said independent agency heads have job protection, that the president can't just fire them because he doesn't like their decisions. But Trump wants the court to overturn that precedent. He wants to establish that the president has absolute authority to fire anyone in the executive branch, including supposedly independent commissioners. And based on the oral arguments, the conservative justices seem sympathetic to Trump's position. If Trump wins this case, the implications are enormous, because suddenly every independent agency becomes not independent. The Federal Reserve could be politicized. The president could fire Fed governors who raise interest rates if it hurts the economy before an election. The FTC could become a tool for going after companies the president doesn't like and protecting companies he does like. The SEC could stop enforcing rules against Trump's allies on Wall Street. Every agency that's supposed to be neutral and independent could become an extension of the White House. That's not how the system is supposed to work. That's authoritarianism. And Trump's not waiting for the court to decide. He's already moving to take control. On February 18, 2025, Trump issued an executive order that mandates White House liaisons in independent agencies. These liaisons would have oversight over agency funding and projects. They'd be the White House's eyes and ears inside supposedly independent agencies. They'd report back to Trump about what the agencies are doing, and they'd have power to influence agency decisions. That's direct White House control over agencies that are supposed to be independent. That's exactly what the laws creating these agencies were designed to prevent. Trump has also publicly attacked Federal Reserve Governor Lisa Cook. He's called her out by name, he's criticized her decisions, and according to reports, he's considered firing her. The Federal Reserve is supposed to be the most independent agency we have. Presidents aren't supposed to interfere with Fed decisions, but Trump doesn't care. He wants the Fed to do what's good for him politically, and he's willing to fire governors who don't comply. That's terrifying, because the Fed controls interest rates and monetary policy. If that becomes politicized, if presidents start making Fed decisions based on what helps them in elections rather than what's good for the economy, we could see massive inflation, financial crashes, economic chaos, and agencies are already in chaos. Because Trump's fired so many commissioners and board members, some agencies don't have enough people to function. Their boards are vacant. They can't make decisions because they don't have a quorum. Or Trump's filling the vacancies with loyalists who have no expertise but are politically reliable. Either way, the agencies can't do their jobs properly. Consumer protection suffers, antitrust enforcement stops, financial regulation weakens. The whole regulatory system is breaking down because Trump is more interested in control than competence. So over the next 20 minutes, we're going to break down exactly what Trump is doing to independent agencies. We're going to look at the Supreme Court case that could give him unlimited firing power. We're going to talk about what happens if agencies like the Fed become politicized. And we're going to figure out what it means when the president can control every aspect of government with no checks on his power. Because this is one of the most important and underreported stories of Trump's second term. Let's get into it. Alright, so let's dig into the specifics of what Trump is actually doing and why it's so dangerous. Because this isn't just about firing a few people. This is a systematic assault on the structure of American government. And if Trump succeeds, it fundamentally changes how the country is run. So let's start with what independent agencies are and why they exist. The federal government has lots of agencies. Some are regular cabinet departments like the State Department or Defense Department. Those are clearly under presidential control. The president appoints the secretary and can fire them at will. But then there are independent agencies, the Federal Reserve, the Federal Trade Commission, the Securities and Exchange Commission, the National Labor Relations Board, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. These agencies were deliberately set up to be independent from presidential control. Their leaders serve fixed terms. They can only be fired for cause, meaning you have to prove they did something wrong. And the reason for this structure is that these agencies need to make decisions based on expertise and law, not based on what's politically convenient for the president. Take the Federal Reserve as the most important example. The Fed controls monetary policy, they set interest rates, they manage the money supply, and those decisions have huge impacts on the economy. If interest rates are too low, you get inflation. If they're too high, you get recession. The Fed has to balance these risks and make decisions that are good for the country long term. But what's good for the country long term isn't always what's good for a president politically. A president facing re-election might want low interest rates to juice the economy, even if that causes inflation down the road. So the Fed is independent. Fed governors serve 14-year terms. They can't be fired by the president. That way they can make unpopular decisions, if those decisions are economically sound, without worrying about getting fired. The same logic applies to other independent agencies. The FTC enforces antitrust law. Sometimes that means going after big companies that have political connections. The SEC regulates Wall Street. Sometimes that means investigating and punishing financial fraud by wealthy donors. These agencies need independence to do their jobs properly. If the president could fire commissioners whenever he wanted, agencies would be scared to take actions that might anger the White House. They'd become political tools rather than neutral enforcers of law. But Trump sees it completely differently. To Trump, these independent agencies are part of the deep state. They're unelected bureaucrats who think they can ignore what the president wants. And Trump's view is that the president is elected by the people, and therefore the president should control everything in the executive branch. If an agency head disagrees with Trump, he should be able to fire them and replace them with someone loyal. That's Trump's position, and he's been acting on it. According to a report from the Economic Policy Institute published in October 2025, Trump has fired dozens of independent agency leaders, he's removed FTC commissioners, he's removed members of other agency boards, and he's doing it without cause. He's not claiming they committed misconduct. He's not saying they're incompetent. He's just firing them because they made decisions he didn't like or because he wants to install his own people. And when people sue, when they challenge their firings in court, Trump's lawyers argue that the laws protecting these commissioners are unconstitutional, that the president has inherent authority to fire anyone in the executive branch. That's Trump's legal theory. And that brings us to the Supreme Court case. The case involves an FTC commissioner who Trump fired. The commissioner sued, saying the firing was illegal. Under the law that created the FTC, commissioners can only be fired for inefficiency, neglect of duty, or malfeasance in office. That's the standard. You have to prove they did something wrong. But Trump fired this commissioner without meeting that standard. Just fired them. And now the case is at the Supreme Court, asking whether the law protecting FTC commissioners is constitutional. On December 8th, the court heard oral arguments, and based on what the conservative justices said, Trump might win. The key precedent is a case called Humphrey's Executor from 1935. That case upheld the independence of the FTC. It said Congress can create independent agencies with job protections for their leaders. But Trump's lawyers are asking the court to overturn Humphrey's Executor. They're arguing it was wrongly decided, that it violates separation of powers, that the president must have control over everyone who exercises executive power. And the conservative justices, especially Justices Thomas and Alito, they've been skeptical of independent agencies for years. They might be ready to overturn this 90-year-old precedent. If Trump wins this case, the consequences are enormous, because it wouldn't just be about the FTC. It would apply to every independent agency, the Federal Reserve, the SEC, the NLRB, the CFPB, all of them. Suddenly the president could fire agency heads at will. And that means every future president could do the same thing. The Fed becomes politicized. Whoever's president gets to control monetary policy based on what helps them politically. The SEC becomes politicized. Presidents can tell securities regulators to go easy on their donors and crack down on their enemies. Every independent agency becomes a political weapon. That's catastrophic for rule of law and economic stability. But Trump's not waiting for the court to decide. He's already taking steps to control independent agencies through executive action. On February 18, 2025, Trump issued an executive order that requires independent agencies to install White House liaisons. These are people who report to the White House and have oversight over agency operations, including funding and projects. That's direct White House control. The whole point of independent agencies is they're not supposed to have White House oversight. But Trump's imposing it anyway through executive order, and agencies are complying because they're scared of what happens if they don't. The executive order also gives these White House liaisons power to review and influence agency decisions. So before an independent agency takes a major action, before they file an antitrust lawsuit or issue a new regulation, they have to run it by the White House liaison. And if the liaison says no, the White House doesn't want this agency to do this, the agency might back down. That's political interference in supposedly independent decision-making. That's exactly what the system was designed to prevent, but Trump's doing it openly. And Trump's attacks on the Federal Reserve are especially alarming. Trump has publicly criticized Fed Governor Lisa Cook. He's called her out by name on social media. He's complained about her votes on interest rates. And according to reports, Trump has discussed with advisors whether he can fire her. Fed governors are supposed to be completely off limits to the president. The Fed's independence is sacred. Every modern president has respected that, but Trump doesn't care. He wants the Fed to keep interest rates low because that helps the economy and helps him politically. And if governors won't go along, he wants to fire them and replace them with people who will. If Trump actually fires a Fed governor, that would be unprecedented. It would trigger a constitutional crisis. It would shake financial markets because investors rely on the Fed's independence. If the Fed becomes politicized, if presidents start firing governors to manipulate monetary policy, you lose credibility. International investors stop trusting the dollar. Inflation expectations become unanchored. You could see massive economic damage just from politicizing the Fed. But Trump seems willing to risk all of that to get the Fed to do what he wants. And the chaos at agencies is already happening. Because Trump's fired so many commissioners, some agencies can't function. Agency boards need a certain number of members to have a quorum to make decisions. But if Trump fires half the board and doesn't replace them, or only replaces them with temporary loyalists, the agency is paralyzed. They can't vote on regulations. They can't approve enforcement actions. They can't do their basic jobs. And that's by design. Because if agencies can't function, they can't regulate. They can't go after companies. They can't protect consumers. Trump gets deregulation through chaos. Or Trump fills vacancies with completely unqualified loyalists, people who have no expertise in the agency's mission, but who Trump trusts to do what he wants. So you end up with FTC commissioners who don't understand antitrust law. SEC commissioners who don't understand securities regulation, Fed governors who don't understand monetary policy. The agencies become incompetent because Trump cares more about loyalty than expertise, and that leads to bad decisions that hurt the economy and hurt consumers. This connects to Trump's broader Schedule F plan. That's his effort to reclassify tens of thousands of federal civil servants as political appointees so he can fire them and replace them with loyalists. Trump tried to implement Schedule F at the end of his first term, but Biden reversed it. Now Trump's trying again, and the independent agency fight is part of the same project. Trump wants total control over the executive branch. He wants everyone who works for the government to be loyal to him personally, rather than loyal to the Constitution, or the law, or the public interest. That's authoritarianism. That's what happens in countries where the government exists to serve the leader, rather than the people. So we're watching a systematic dismantling of institutional independence. Trump is attacking agencies that are supposed to be neutral. He's firing people who are supposed to have job protection. He's installing White House overseers in agencies that are supposed to be independent. And he's asking the Supreme Court to bless all of it by overturning the legal precedents that protect agency independence. If he succeeds, the American system of government looks fundamentally different. Let's talk about what that means. Okay, so let's break down what this actually means if Trump succeeds in destroying agency independence, because the implications touch everything: the economy, consumer protection, financial stability, rule of law, separation of powers. This is one of those things that sounds technical and boring, but is actually hugely important for how the country functions. Here's point 1. If the president can fire independent agency heads at will, you get massive economic instability. Because right now, markets trust that agencies like the Fed and the SEC are making decisions based on economics and law, not based on politics. That trust is valuable. It keeps interest rates stable. It keeps financial markets functioning. It attracts international investment. But if those agencies become political, if everyone knows the president is manipulating them for short-term political gain, you lose that trust. And losing trust has real economic consequences. Take the Federal Reserve. Right now, when the Fed raises interest rates to fight inflation, people believe they're doing it because it's economically necessary. Bond markets adjust. Inflation expectations stay anchored. The system works. But if Trump can fire Fed governors and everyone knows the Fed is making decisions to help Trump politically, what happens? Bond markets freak out because they don't know if rates are set based on economics or politics. Inflation expectations become unstable because people don't trust the Fed to fight inflation. If that's politically inconvenient for the president, you could see inflation spike. You could see the dollar lose value. You could see a financial crisis triggered just by the loss of Fed independence. And the same logic applies to other agencies. The SEC regulates Wall Street. Right now, when the SEC prosecutes financial fraud, people trust that they're going after actual wrongdoing. But if the SEC becomes political, if everyone knows the president can fire SEC commissioners who go after his donors, you lose that trust. Financial fraud becomes easier because bad actors know enforcement is politically influenced. Honest companies lose faith in the system. You get a less trustworthy, less efficient financial system. That hurts everyone except the fraudsters. Point 2. This is really about Trump trying to eliminate checks on presidential power. Because independent agencies are one of the few parts of government that can tell a president no. Congress is supposed to check the president, but if the president's party controls Congress, that doesn't work. Courts can check the president, but only in specific cases and only after the fact. Independent agencies are ongoing checks. They can refuse to do what the president wants. They can investigate and prosecute actions the president supports. They're institutional resistance to presidential overreach, but Trump hates that. He thinks anyone who can tell him no is illegitimate. He sees independent agencies as obstacles to his power rather than as necessary checks, and he's trying to eliminate those checks by taking control of the agencies. If he succeeds, there's basically nothing left to constrain presidential power in the executive branch. The president controls the Justice Department. The president controls all the cabinet departments, and now the president controls the supposedly independent agencies too. That's too much power in one person's hands. That's how you get authoritarianism. And this isn't just about Trump. If Trump establishes this precedent, if the Supreme Court rules that presidents can fire independent agency heads at will, every future president will have that power. A future Democratic president could politicize the Fed, just like Trump could. They could use the FTC and SEC as political weapons, just like Trump could. The problem isn't just Trump's abuse of power. The problem is that Trump is trying to permanently change the rules in ways that will enable abuse by every future president. Once you destroy institutional independence, you can't easily rebuild it. Point 3. The chaos at agencies is already causing real harm to ordinary Americans. Because when agencies can't function, when their boards are vacant or filled with unqualified loyalists, they can't protect consumers. They can't enforce antitrust law. They can't regulate dangerous products. The FTC is supposed to stop deceptive business practices. But if the FTC is paralyzed by Trump's firings, who's protecting consumers from scams? The CFPB is supposed to regulate predatory lending. But if Trump guts the CFPB, who's protecting people from abusive financial practices? These agencies exist for a reason. They solve real problems, and Trump is breaking them. And the business community should be worried about this too, because even though Trump frames this as deregulation and cutting red tape, what he's actually creating is uncertainty and chaos. Businesses need stable, predictable regulation. They need to know what the rules are. When agencies are dysfunctional, when leadership keeps changing, when rules keep flip-flopping based on politics, that creates uncertainty, and businesses hate uncertainty. It makes planning impossible. It makes investment risky. So Trump's assault on independent agencies might actually hurt the economy, even if it gets rid of some regulations. Now let's talk about the political angle, because Trump supporters love this. They see him taking on the deep state and draining the swamp. They think unelected bureaucrats shouldn't be able to thwart the president's agenda, and there's a populist appeal to that message. But what Trump's actually doing is concentrating power in himself. He's not draining the swamp. He's becoming the swamp. He's making himself more powerful and less accountable. And if Trump can fire anyone who disagrees with him, if he can surround himself with pure loyalists, that's incredibly dangerous regardless of your politics. Democrats are trying to make this an issue. They're arguing Trump is creating an imperial presidency, that he's destroying checks and balances, that he's turning the federal government into a tool for his personal interests rather than the public interest. And that message might resonate with people who care about institutional stability and rule of law. But I don't know if it cuts through to average voters who aren't paying close attention to these agency fights. This stuff is complicated, it's technical, it's hard to explain in a soundbite why independent agency protections matter. So Trump might get away with this politically, even though what he's doing is really dangerous. The Supreme Court decision is going to be the key moment. If the court sides with Trump and overturns Humphrey's executor, that's a green light for Trump to completely politicize independent agencies. If the court sides against Trump and upholds agency independence, that puts real limits on what Trump can do. The oral arguments suggested the conservative justices are sympathetic to Trump, but we won't know for sure until the court issues its opinion, which could be months from now. In the meantime, Trump is going to keep firing people and keep pushing the boundaries. And here's what's really scary. Even if Trump loses at the Supreme Court, he's already done massive damage because he's shown that you can just fire protected commissioners and dare the courts to stop you. The legal process takes months or years. By the time a court rules the damage is done, the agency is disrupted, the commissioners are gone, and even if the court says the firings were illegal, Trump's already accomplished his goal of chaos. So the legal protections aren't as strong as we thought. If a president is shameless enough, they can violate those protections and get away with it long enough to achieve their aims. So where does this leave us? Trump is systematically attacking independent agencies. He's firing protected commissioners. He's installing White House overseers. He's trying to get the Supreme Court to overturn the precedents that protect agency independence. And if he succeeds, the entire structure of American government changes. Agencies that are supposed to be neutral become political. The president gains enormous unchecked power. Economic stability gets threatened because agencies like the Fed can be manipulated. And there's no institutional resistance left to presidential overreach. That's where we're headed. And most Americans have no idea it's happening because this story is too complicated and technical to get major media coverage. But it matters. This is one of the most important fights of Trump's presidency, and we're going to see in the coming months whether Trump wins or whether the system can defend itself. Pay attention to this, because what happens here is going to shape American government for generations.